I mentioned in my review of The Austrian Mind a thinker by the name of Karl Mannheim, who I described as a sociologist of knowledge. It's a pretty sticky field to work in, and because of course, highly theoretical and just sort of difficult to think at that level of abstraction and come out with something cogent and meaningful. This next book that I'm going to review for you is actually a series of lectures by the late British social anthropologist Mary Douglas. And it's very much along the same lines, sort of approached from slightly a different angle, from obviously social anthropology and not sociology. But it's a really, really fascinating book. And it's called How Institutions Think by Mary Douglas. Ever since the time of Descartes, and probably since the time of the ancient Greeks, we've been deeply enamored with the idea that we, as conscious, rational, decision-making beings, control the way that we think and act. While Mary Douglas certainly doesn't suggest that we're just mindless cogs in a machine, she does offer some interesting insights into how we think about institutions, categories, and rationality, especially how rationality arises out of institutions and categories, that have serious implications for the idea of wholly autonomous human intellectual agencies. Douglas was one of the greatest social anthropologists to come out of England in the 20th century, and is probably a little bit better known for some of her other books, including Purity and Danger, Risk and Blame, and Implicit Meanings. How Institutions Think is a series of the Frank W. Abrams lectures that she delivered at Syracuse University in 1985. Some scientific ideas, this is how she starts the book, enter the world, readily accepted and widely read by an eager scholarly community. Others languish, not because they're of a lesser quality and maybe not even because they're incorrect. For example, she talks about Ludwig Fleck's book on the discovery of syphilis, which she titled The Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact. And it was certainly one of the latter, one of those that is sort of forgotten, but not because it's wrong. Fleck in this book anticipated a kind of social constructivism as it's applied to scientific theory, and he said that scientific ideas are accepted or rejected into a canon for reasons not because of their inherent worth, but because certain social conditions, which Fleck called thought conditions or thought collectives, and in German, Fleck was writing in German, thought collectives would be, in the original German, Denkkollektiv. That these thought collections either allow or disallow their admittance into the scientific world. The Denkkollektiv is a whole matrix of social circumstances, thoughts, and assumptions that envelop the scientific project and the scientific idea. And a new idea substantively differs from one aspect. If it differs substantively from one aspect in the Denkkollektiv, it will be ignored. Not consciously by individual scientists, but by the scientific profession as an institution, as a whole. This is where Douglas picks up in her anthropological history of what she calls her classificatory enterprise. How can the phenomena that Fleck described really happen? What was it about science, or what is it about any institution, that shapes social cognition and categories so profoundly as to be able to exclude them if they bump heads, so to speak? How do these institutions develop, and why? Following Durkheim's lead, Douglas claims that autonomy, in the sense of radical social individualism and atomization, was in many respects an illusion, and that we're marked by a strong sense of social solidarity, shared through, quote, classification, logical operations, and guiding metaphors that are given to the individual by society. One of Douglas's implicit arguments is that the difference between sociology, which is group action, and psychology, which is the action of a single agent, is wrong-headed. Instead, she asserts that for a rule to turn into a legitimate social convention, it needs a parallel cognitive convention to sustain it. Social institutions encode information and then use that information to minimize the entropy or inherent disorder in decision-making. The stabilizing principle of institutions, what keeps them from breaking down, is that they, quote-unquote, naturalize social classifications. By naturalizing the social in reason, the institution automatically legitimizes it. After all, one of the first priorities of the institution should be legitimacy, or else it would incur so much doubt that it would eventually be destroyed. Douglas considers the common social analogy of likening the roles of men and women to that of the left and the right hand. The logic of complementarity in nature legitimizes the social order, constructing a rationality which seems like it was there even before time began. Even the institution of sameness, yes, even sameness, as in logical similarity or identity, A equals A in mathematics, is an institution. Even the institution of sameness is time and culturally sensitive. Douglas cites the example in Leviticus of the camel, the hare, and the rock badger, which you're probably familiar with. The camel, the hare, and the rock badger all chew cud, which would lead us to believe that they were all classified as cud-chewing ungulates. That is, animals that have hooves. However, since they don't have cloven hooves, they're excluded. So the criterion of difference here, having a cloven hoof, is completely arbitrary, yet it's the sole category that bestows sameness on a group of individuals. Douglas makes it clear that categorizations like this are not cool, objective observations into the inner workings of nature. They're very telling maps that model the interactions of the members of the society. Institutions do more than order categorical knowledge, though. They also filter information in such a way that they can be said to remember and even forget. Fleck's book recounts a classic case of institutional forgetting. The failure of a legitimate scientific idea to be accepted into the prevailing canon of scientific knowledge is usually the result of a lack of what she calls formulaic interlocking with normal procedures of validation. For an idea to gain acceptance, it sometimes has to exploit, quote, the major analogies of which the socio-cognitive system rests. Another famous British anthropologist, Evans Pritchard, wrote a study of the Noor people, which focuses largely on this institutional remembering, according to Douglas, discovering what she calls an explicit demonstration of how institutions direct and control memory. He showed, according to her, how economic interactions, including weddings and cattle distribution, order the memory of ancestors. The one thing I was curious about while reading this book was that she never mentioned Berger's social construction of reality, which covers much of the same territory. Of course, Berger is a sociologist, sort of like Carl Mannheim was, who I mentioned at the top of the video, not an anthropologist, so he has a slightly different take. And Berger is one of the few sources that I've read on topics that you could think of as vaguely related to the sociology of knowledge. So, I'd read the Berger sometime around at the time I finished this, and thought they shed a lot of light on one another, even though the burger isn't mentioned in here. This is a really, really fascinating book, especially if you're one of those really skeptical people who likes to think about how things that are so taken for granted are in fact institutionally shaped by time, culture, process, the intersection between sociology and psychology. I mean, it's just got tons of fascinating stuff in here. And the lectures they're very short. It's about 130 pages. A really fascinating book. How Institutions Think by Mary Douglas.